So now it's time to talk about the really sticky part of the ethics material for the exam. So we've talked already about the Code of Ethics, and there's great things to be said there, and I think it's a poetic statement, and if we all lived by the Code of Ethics, the world would be a better place. There's some stuff to come after the guidance for standards here that is going to be important on the exam as well. But the big rock to deal with in terms of the ethics material is guidance for standards. So there's the 7 standards, and if there were just 7, if there was really just 7 standards, it wouldn't seem so bad. But it's 7 standards with parts A and B and C and so forth. And under those, you've got to know the standard, but then you have some guidance for it, and then you have recommended procedures. And in the end, there's just lots of detail here. And you can do well on the ethics material on the exam. It pays to know it because of the exam. It also pays to know it because if you're watching this video, you've signed something saying you're going to live by these standards. So being able to live up to your commitment would be great as well. But this is something that is a departure from the rest of the curriculum. If you are really good with numbers and quant stuff and economic analysis and all those types of things, well, that's sort of a power alley for most of us that work in the finance profession. This is really important, but it is not the way your synapses fire off around this are going to be different than that would happen anywhere else in the curriculum. So it just takes some extra time. And what you need to be able to do, or what you have to do, is you have to go through and study this stuff with a fairly powerful microscope, underline, take notes, that sort of thing, answer lots of questions, and in the end, this is just a lot of material to get on top of. So what we're going to do for the next couple of hours, I know that sounds daunting, is to go through each of the 7 standards and through each part one by one, try to talk about it, bring out a few nuances for those where possible, and just sort of plow through it, which is what you have to do to prepare for this important part of the exam. So since there are 7 standards, I thought we would be very clever and start with standard 1. Okay, so let's start with this standard 1, which deals with professionalism. And standard 1 part A is knowledge of the law. So, and it's probably worth mentioning here that you don't have to know the numbering system. Okay, so in terms of standard 1A is knowledge of the law, but on the exam, you will be expected to know what standard has been violated. So you won't have to know this as knowledge of the law as 1A, but you will have to know, oh, that constitutes a violation of the standards around knowledge of the law. So the numbering system isn't important, but knowing the structure that this is professionalism, knowledge of the law, is part of that, is something that is likely to be important on the exam. So what does it mean to have a knowledge of the law, or the standards surrounding knowledge of the law? Well, that means you've got to understand and comply with the laws. Okay, so laws, rules, regulations, including, of course, our code and standards, what we're studying right now, of any government, regulatory agency, or association governing your professional activities. So what about when you get conflicts between those? So one system, one jurisdiction, if you want to think of it that way, say the regulation says one thing, and you get the code and standards that says something else. Well, it's your job to determine which of those implies the more strict obligation, and you comply with whatever is more strict. And we'll come across several good examples of this, but if you think of insider trading, well, there are legal jurisdictions on the planet where insider trading is not illegal, okay? But at least for all intents and purposes, in the code and standards, we're going to see that it is unethical. So it's a violation of the standards. So it's fine. The law in some countries will say, sure, you can do that if you want to, but the code and standards says you can't. Well, if you're subject to both of those, the code and standards and the laws of this jurisdiction, you've got to determine what's more strict. In this case, it prohibits insider trading in the code and standards. Okay, well, then that's the more strict rule. That's what you have to adhere to. All right, so you've got to determine what is more strict of the multiple jurisdictions and rules out there, and comply with the more strict version. Okay, also, you can't knowingly assist in a violation, and you have to interpret this knowingly assist thing fairly broadly. So knowledge of something untoward going on is, sort of a tacit acceptance or approval. Could be could be viewed as assistance, and you cannot be associated with that. So if somebody is doing something they shouldn't be, well, you've got to dissociate yourself from unethical activities. Okay, so in terms of guidance here, well, we already talked about the idea that it's going to be the most strict of the various most strict of the various rules, if you want to think of it that way, that would be applicable, laws versus supervisory agencies versus the code and standards. So what happens if there is a violation? Well, the first thing you should do is notify your supervisor or your firm's compliance department. Okay, you may confront the wrongdoer directly. So if you observe someone doing something that is unethical, you can confront them if that is, in your opinion, the proper thing to do. You do not have to do that. The code does not require you to go to this individual and say, hey, you are an unethical scumbag, and I saw what you did, and you need to stop, right? Now, that may be the course of action. It's allowable, okay, but it's not required. What is required is that if you are in any way associated with it, okay, that you dissociate from it. Okay, and that could, in fact, in the extreme case, mean that you have to leave your place of employment. So if they're doing something they shouldn't be doing, you told the people in compliance, you told your supervisor, you told counsel, and they say, well, we don't think this is unethical, even though you've concluded that it is. Well, maybe the only option available to you for dissociation is to go find other employment. Okay, inaction can be construed as participation, right? So it's not sort of the old adage that's all that's required for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. Right? Well, we're not going to let good people do nothing. Inaction can be construed as participation. And then finally, there's no requirement that you report violations to governmental authorities, although it may be appropriate in some cases. So this does not require you to make, to be a whistleblower in terms of, oh, I'm going to go and notify the authorities that this is going on. And it certainly doesn't preclude you from doing it either. Okay? Now, this is a good example of where you have more strict rules versus less strict rules. So here it says there's no requirement. So you do not have to report these bad actors to the appropriate government authority. Okay? But if you look at the laws, at least in the United States, there are some things that you have to report. There are some aspects of money laundering, and I suppose laws could have changed since I was studying this, but if you observed money laundering activity, okay, you were legally required to report it. Okay? So the code and standards says you don't have to. The law says you do have to. In this case, the law more precisely defines your behavior. Okay, well, then you have to comply with the law. So anyway, this would be an example of where you have to identify what is most strict and comply with it. So that's the guidance associated with this knowledge of the law. Now, the thing that I find difficult about, or most difficult about the code and standards, or the guidance for the standards here in particular, is I'm okay with knowing what the standard is and understanding the nuances of how they talk about implementing that standard. I find those things to be pretty straightforward and sort of make good sense. Being a good person will help you a little bit with this. But where I completely lose it is when we have to talk about what's required. That's what we just talked about with guidance versus recommended procedures. So these are things that will help you to comply with the standard. In this case, 1A, knowledge of the law under professionalism. Okay, but all of these things wouldn't necessarily be a requirement. They are, recommended items. What you have to do is what we saw on the last slide. Okay? You've got to know the law. You've got to dissociate from bad activities. You've got to seek counsel where needed, whatever it happens to be. Okay? But these are things that are recommended, and they will test the difference between what's required and what's recommended. So that's something it's a little harder to get on top of, at least for me, but of course, if you're taking this exam, you're probably a lot smarter than I am anyway. So what is recommended? Well, of course, you have to keep informed. Regularly review written compliance procedures, maintain files, all that sort of stuff. You can't really comply with the law, okay, unless you know the law, right? So you should seek compliance or legal advice if needed, okay, and then, encourage your firm to adopt a code of ethics. Now, if you live in the United States and work for one of the major players here in the financial realm, then your employer's already done this, so most of them have adopted a code of ethics, and it's if it's not the CFAI Code of Ethics, it's something that has considered that in its development. So most of this has already occurred, but if you work for a small firm, they don't have a Code of Ethics, well, this is maybe something that you'd want to do. Okay, and then also, still on recommended procedures, distribute information internally on applicable laws and regulations. So if you're in a hedge fund, you do lots of futures trading. Well, as the laws surrounding futures trading change, you want to make sure those are disseminated. And of course, you want to make sure that new people coming in know what those laws are. Have written procedures for reporting suspected violations. So while you as an individual, under the code and standards, if you observe things that are not right, okay, that or be a violation of the law or violation of the code, of the standards of professional conduct here, well, then you've got to tell somebody. You've got to go to your supervisor or to compliance or something, or in the limit, you have to dissociate from that somehow. Okay, but maybe it's also a good idea to have written procedures about how to do that, right? So you know how to do it because you're a seasoned professional, okay, but maybe having a standard policy for approaching this from the firm level would be the right thing to do. And then finally, in the Big Brother realm, okay, members are strongly encouraged to report violations by other members. So again, you're not required to do this, but if you know somebody who is a CFA charter holder, or if they are in the CFA program, they've obligated themselves to comply with this, and you observe them doing something they shouldn't be doing, well, CFAI would like to know about it. So you're encouraged to report violations, although you are not required to. All right? So that's Standard 1A, knowledge of the law. Let's talk about Standard 1B, independence and objectivity. I don't think that all the standards and subsections here are created equally. In fact, a little bit later as we go through this material, I'm going to talk to you about what I think are the 3 pillars. And on one of those pillars, I'm going to cheat a little bit, but nonetheless, not in a way that would be a violation of the code and standards, though, of course. Anyway, but I'm going to cheat a little bit, but this is going to be part of what when I talk about the pillars that underlie the ethics material, this is going to be part of it. That is independence and objectivity. So we are obligated, okay, as financial professionals, as people who are associated in one way or another with the CFA or CFAI, to maintain independence and objectivity. That means we're going to use reasonable care and judgment to achieve and maintain independence in our professional activities. So we're not going to have our decision-making abilities tainted by some sort of conflict of interest is basically what this is getting at. So we're not going to offer, solicit, or accept any compensation that could compromise our independence or objectivity. That is the standard. What about guidance? And there's lots of guidance for this one because it's a big deal. So we got 3 slides on guidance here, but the first one is, well, all right, so what about receiving gifts? Hey, well, receiving a gift that can take on lots of forms. Okay, there is a de minimis rule associated with gifts that is in the material or in our code of ethics or standards of professional conduct. So we're not talking about if you're talking with a broker, let's say you're a portfolio manager, you have discretionary authority over some separate accounts for whoever that happens to be, and you're interacting with a broker and they give you a PIN. Okay. Well, all right, so I suppose that PIN would be a gift, okay, but there's an assumption that we will not sell our integrity for a writing implement. So modest gifts are okay. It's not in this version of the ethics material, so this is not a rule. But to give you an idea of, there was a point at which they said things that were less than $100 were considered modest gifts. So if somebody gave you a t-shirt or something like that, well, that's not something that would impair our objectivity. Okay, now there's an important part here, and that is that we distinguish between gifts from clients and gifts from those that are trying to influence our behavior. So once again, when I'm analyzing a problem on the exam, the way I like to couch this in my mind is to develop a scenario that would create the lowest threshold for what would be a violation of the code and standards. And if there's no violation there, then as you add, client sophistication and those types of things, well, all the threshold could do would be to increase. And I think the situation in which the threshold is lowest is if you consider a portfolio manager that has discretionary authority over the account for an unsophisticated investor. All right, so we'll think of this in terms of a portfolio manager with discretionary authority. Okay, well, all right, so gifts can run between the there's two angles here, right? So when talking about gifts, so a gift could run from the portfolio manager or between the portfolio manager and the client. Okay, well, that's not someone trying to influence behavior in the same way that if we were talking about gifts between the portfolio manager and a broker. Right? So a broker that says, oh, here you can, if you direct a lot of trades to me, or hoping that you will direct a lot of trades to me, wink, wink, grin, grin, I'll let you use the condo in Vail for a weekend. Okay, well, that would be a gift from someone trying to influence the member's decision making. So in the limit, okay, you can accept gifts from clients. Okay, it needs to be disclosed to your employer. Okay, but you can accept gifts from a client. Okay, because that runs along the fiduciary responsibility lines. You cannot accept gifts, other than, of course, de minimis stuff, from someone who would be a third party who would be trying to influence behavior. So you can accept gifts from clients, if it's associated with, you're doing something in the future, then you need to get permission. Always this needs to be disclosed to your employer, again, subject to de minimis rules. So you have a client that gives you a fountain pen, or they give you some of the swag from the swag cabinets when you're visiting them. You get a new ball cap or something. That's not what they're talking about here. Okay, so the member is responsible for hiring outside managers. So I'm supervising some investment activity for a family office, and I'm going to hire managers for different aspects or different portions of the portfolio. So I'm hiring outside managers. Okay, I shouldn't accept travel or gifts or entertainment that could impair my objectivity. Right, so I'm trying to make decisions about who we're going to have managing these pools of money. Okay, well, I've got to be careful about gifts and entertainment, anything that would be significant enough that it could impair my objectivity. I've got to make objective decisions in the best interest of my client about who these outside managers should be. In terms of investment banking relationships, and by the way, this is in my thinking, it's something that is on people's mind, and it seems like it would be easy to write test questions on. So in talking about investment banking relationships, well, if I am an equity research analyst and I work at an investment bank, large diversified financial services firm, okay, I can't let the investment bankers influence my buy-sell decisions, right? So I've got to make an effort to, not an effort, I am responsible for being independent and objective. And if an investment banker comes to me and says, look, we're trying to get a big piece of business from this firm, okay, and if you write a negative report on them, that's going to really make it hard to do. Okay, well, okay, that's a problem, right? You can't bow to pressure for favorable research reports. If we're talking about issuer paid research, that is, the issuer is paying you to write a report. Okay, well, a flat fee structure, okay, is what is certainly preferred, but in any case, it has to be disclosed. Right? So the fact that the issuer is paying you to make this judgment has to be disclosed, and the flat fee structure is certainly preferred. Otherwise, it looks like you're getting paid to make favorable recommendations. And then continuing with guidance here, if you're working for a credit rating firm, okay, you have to avoid the influence of issuing firms. So that's one of the things we learned after the financial crisis, or I guess that became common knowledge after the financial crisis, was the somewhat cozy relationship between the credit rating agencies and the issuers, right? So an issuer would go to a rating agency and say, well, can you rate this for me? And they would end up paying, in some cases, for that to be rated by the firm. Did that have influence? Also, if you are in a position where you're a user of credit ratings, then you have to be aware that there's a potential conflict. So just because something gets rated AA-, okay, that you still have to be aware that there could be bias in that and fold that into your decisions. And best practice is for analysts to pay their own commercial travel to firms being analyzed or to firms' events. So if you're going to make a site visit to a firm as part of your rating activities, well, you should probably just pay for your own travel. That's certainly the best practice anyway, rather than having the firm fly you out there on their private jet while you're eating steak and lobster and having your feet rubbed, right? So anyway, so that's the independence and objectivity guidance. Okay, what about recommended procedures here? Well, the point here is that we have to protect the integrity of our opinions. So we are taking investment action, we're making recommendations, all those sorts of things. Okay, when you're working in our professional realm and along the lines of our fiduciary relationships, okay, we have to maintain the integrity of our opinions, and we have to avoid anything that's going to make our opinions biased, right? So this is really sort of the bottom line, but that we're underpinning all this. But then there's a few helpful things. We ought to have a restricted list. That's the things that the list of companies that we're not going to release opinions on, or that we're not going to change opinions on, or maybe not change opinions. Opinions need to be changed, they need to be changed, but nonetheless, we're going to have blackout dates. We're not going to issue new opinions on these firms if we're not already doing it, and we're also not going to have employees trading in the stock of those firms, that type of thing. If we have special cost arrangements, we ought to restrict those. Again, that's the sort of thing that leads to a potential conflict of interest. We're going to limit gifts, so the firm should place clear value limits on that. Again, most firms do not mind fountain pens. I guess they're not even really called fountain pens anymore. But if somebody gives you a pen that has their company logo on it, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about things that are big enough to potentially influence you. And we'll get to talk about this last item. We'll talk about a lot later. But that is, we need to be careful with IPO shares, right? So this is a hot topic and how we allocate those. So the point here is, however we allocate them, okay, the decisions that we make on how to allocate shares in a hot IPO, well, we have to be independent and objective in how we come to those decisions.